Be me. Name is Miranda. 31 years old, diversity and inclusion specialist from San Francisco. Been working in tech activism for 8 years now. Built my whole career on pushing for systemic change. Workshops, training programs, policy overhauls, you name it. Started as a junior HR coordinator right out of college. Worked my way up by being the loudest voice in the room. The one willing to say what others were afraid to say. Always believed workplaces needed to be reformed. Traditional structures were inherently problematic. People like me were necessary to guide organizations toward a more equitable future. My LinkedIn was full of posts about dismantling hierarchies, centering marginalized voices in every conversation, holding leadership accountable for systemic failures. I genuinely believed I was doing important work, and the validation I received reinforced that constantly. Colleagues praised my courage. Social media followers celebrated my takes. I was invited to speak at conferences about workplace transformation. Everything told me I was on the right path. Then I got recruited by a tech company in Copenhagen. Nordvik Solutions, about 120 employees. They wanted someone to handle diversity initiatives, build out their inclusion programming. The recruiter found my profile and thought I'd be perfect. Denmark consistently ranked happiest country in the world. Progressive values, gender equality, strong social systems. I thought this was my dream opportunity, a chance to bring American best practices to an already progressive culture, help them become even more advanced, maybe even learn some things to bring back home. The relocation package was generous. Salary was competitive even by San Francisco standards. Chance to live in Scandinavia felt like an adventure. Said yes immediately, didn't even negotiate. Started telling everyone about my exciting move. Friends threw me a going-away party. Everyone's saying how lucky I was. How Denmark would be perfect for someone like me. One friend said I'd probably never come back. Another joked that I'd be running the place within a year. I believed all of it. Packed my apartment into storage. Gave away furniture I couldn't take. Said goodbye to my life in San Francisco. Ready to start fresh in Copenhagen. Landed on a cold January morning. Gray skies, freezing wind, but I didn't care. This was the beginning of something amazing. Company put me up in temporary housing. Nice apartment in a trendy neighborhood. Gave me a week to settle before starting work. I spent that week exploring the city. Everyone seemed so calm and content. No homeless encampments like San Francisco. No signs of hardship. No visible desperation. Clean streets, efficient public transit. People cycling everywhere, even in winter. I thought I had found utopia. Started work the following Monday. Office was in a converted warehouse. Very trendy, very Scandinavian design. Open plan with lots of natural light. Plants everywhere. Modern furniture. Everyone seemed relaxed in a way American offices never manage. Despite all the beanbags and ping-pong tables back home, my first observation was that nobody seemed stressed, which I initially interpreted as healthy culture, but would later reframe as complacency. Complacency that needed to be disrupted. My manager Henrik greeted me warmly. 45 years old, been with the company for 12 years. Calm demeanor, soft-spoken, direct eye contact. Gave me the tour, introduced me to the team. Everyone spoke perfect English. Made me feel welcome immediately. Henrik explained Danish work culture during our first meeting. 37-hour work week, he says. That's the standard here, not the exception. Work-life balance is sacred. Nobody stays past 5 unless absolutely necessary. And even then they'd rather come in early the next day. Everyone takes full lunch breaks, usually together as a team. It's important for building relationships. Decisions are made by consensus, not top-down directives. Everyone's input is valued equally. We have a flat hierarchy here. Titles matter less than contributions. The CEO eats lunch with the interns. Sounds nice, I thought to myself, but also sounds like a lack of urgency, a lack of drive toward real change. I nodded along and took mental notes. already thinking about what needed to change. First week was supposed to be about learning, understanding how things operated, before making any suggestions or proposals. Henrik was very clear about this. Take your time, he said. Observe, ask questions, learn our ways. Then, if you see genuine problems, we can discuss appropriate solutions together. I agreed outwardly, but inwardly, I was already planning. Everywhere I looked, I saw problems. Problems my training had prepared me to identify. Leadership team was predominantly male. Technical roles skewed heavily toward men. Administrative roles skewed toward women. Classic patterns I'd seen in every American company. Nobody was talking about these patterns. Nobody seemed to be working to address them. This bothered me more each day. Started taking notes immediately, documenting what I saw as evidence, building the case I would eventually make. 4. Comprehensive reform of the organization. Gender ratios by department. Composition of leadership meetings. Who spoke most in discussions? Who got interrupted and by whom? All the metrics I'd been trained to track. By end of week 1, I had a full assessment document. 20 pages of findings and recommendations. Mandatory bias training for all employees. Restructured hiring processes with demographic targets. Creation of affinity groups for underrepresented employees. Regular audits of promotion and compensation decisions. Implementation of inclusive language guidelines. Monthly diversity metrics reporting to leadership. Standard stuff in San Francisco. The kind of thing that would be welcomed as evidence of serious commitment to progress. I scheduled a meeting with Henrik for Monday, eager to present my findings. Confident he would appreciate my initiative, my expertise in identifying these issues, ready to start making changes. The meeting did not go well. Henrik listened patiently to my presentation, nodded occasionally as I walked through each recommendation, but his expression was unreadable. Something in his eyes I couldn't quite identify. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked one simple question. Why do you think these changes are necessary? What specific problems have you observed that led you to conclude, we need this level of intervention? I was prepared for this. Explain my observations about gender ratios, the composition of leadership, the absence of programming I considered essential, the patterns that matched problematic organizations in America. Henrik listened again, still patient, still calm. Then he said something I didn't expect. In Denmark, we've spent decades building systems that give everyone genuine choice about how to live and work. Generous parental leave, 52 weeks that can be split between parents. Subsidized childcare that makes working accessible. Flexible work arrangements that accommodate different priorities. Strong social safety nets that reduce financial pressure. Healthcare that isn't tied to employment. Education that's free through university. The patterns you're observing aren't discrimination. They're people making different choices. When those choices are genuinely free, women here can do anything men can do. They have every opportunity. But many choose paths that prioritize different things. That's not a problem to be solved. That's freedom working as intended. I pushed back immediately. But choices are always shaped by societal expectations. Subtle biases that channel people towards certain paths. True equality requires actively working to change these patterns, not just accepting them as natural. We need to be disrupting these assumptions, pushing for different outcomes. Henrik's response was patient but firm. What you're proposing would be seen as disrespectful here, implying that people's choices aren't valid, that they need to be corrected by someone who knows better. We don't tell women they should want leadership roles. We don't tell men they should want care work. We create the conditions for genuine choice. And then we respect whatever people choose. He suggested I take more time to learn, to understand the culture, before proposing changes. If you still see genuine problems after learning more, we can discuss appropriate ways to address them. But please, take time to understand first. I left that meeting frustrated, interpreted his response as exactly the kind of resistance I had been trained to push through. In my experience, resistance meant you were on the right track, that you were challenging comfortable people, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths they would rather ignore. The idea that resistance might mean I was wrong, that my approach might be inappropriate for this context, simply didn't occur to me. I had years of success proving my methods worked. Why would Denmark be any different? Over the next few days, I escalated. Started having conversations with colleagues, framing them as casual discussions, but really building support for changes I wanted, testing who might be allies, who might help push leadership to act. Some colleagues listened politely, seemed interested in my perspective, asked questions about how things worked in America. Others seemed confused, unsure why I was so focused on these topics. A few started avoiding me, finding excuses to leave conversations, not sitting near me at lunch. I interpreted all of this as proof that I was making people uncomfortable in necessary ways. Discomfort precedes growth. That's what I had always believed. Lars, a senior developer who'd been with the company for a decade, finally told me directly what others were thinking. He pulled me aside after a meeting. "Your approach is being perceived as aggressive," he said, "and culturally insensitive. You're coming across as an American who thinks she knows better than people who've been living and working here their whole lives. People are starting to avoid you, not because they're threatened by your ideas, but because your style feels disrespectful. I'm telling you this as a warning, not as an attack." I received it as evidence he was part of the problem. Another person defending the status quo, uncomfortable with the changes I was trying to bring, not as the warning it was clearly intended to be. In retrospect, Lars was trying to help me, trying to save my job, and I was too arrogant to hear it. The breaking point came on Wednesday, at the communal staff lunch. I later learned this was almost sacred in Danish work culture. Everyone eats together, talking about life, not just work, building relationships that make collaboration easier. It's not a meeting, it's a ritual, a time for connection and relaxation. I chose that moment to raise my concerns, brought the issues to the whole group, thought it was democratic, getting everyone's input. I laid out my findings about the organization, the gender ratios, the patterns I'd observed. Suggested we needed serious conversation about systemic changes that would make the workplace more equitable. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced. Not the uncomfortable silence of people wrestling with hard truths, which is what I expected, but the silence of genuine shock. People looking at each other with wide eyes, unsure how to respond to such a breach of norms. I had violated something fundamental, but I didn't realize it at the time. Freya, a project manager who'd been friendly with me since arrival, quietly said that lunch was not the appropriate time for this, that I might want to speak with HR about proper channels for raising concerns. I interpreted her response as deflection, an attempt to protect the status quo by pushing uncomfortable conversations into bureaucratic processes where they could be quietly buried. Another colleague stood up and left the table without saying anything. Others followed shortly after. The lunch broke up earlier than usual, and I thought I had made an impact, made people uncomfortable enough to think. I was proud of myself. After lunch, I received a meeting invitation from Astrid in HR, scheduled for the following morning. I assumed this was the proper channel Freya had mentioned, an opportunity to make my case to someone with authority to act. I spent that evening preparing my arguments, refining my presentation, adding more data to support my recommendations, convinced that if I could just explain clearly enough, someone would understand the importance of what I was trying to accomplish. I genuinely believed I was about to break through, find an ally who would help me implement the changes the organization needed. The meeting with Astrid the next morning was not what I expected. She was polite but serious. No small talk, straight to business. She began by explaining that several colleagues had raised concerns about my behavior since arriving, describing interactions that they found aggressive, culturally insensitive, and disruptive to the collaborative environment the company had spent years building. She said Henrik had reported our meeting. His concerns about my approach. My actions at the staff lunch had been the final confirmation that there was a serious mismatch between my working style and the company's culture. I started to defend myself, to explain that I was just trying to do the job I had been hired to do. Astrid stopped me and explained something about Danish employment law that I had never bothered to research. Denmark operates on what they call flexicurity, a system that makes it relatively easy for companies to hire and fire employees while providing strong social safety nets for those who lose their jobs, unlike in America, where termination often requires extensive documentation and process. Danish companies can end employment relationships quickly. When there's a clear mismatch, the safety net catches the employee, so the system is considered fair to both sides. She told me my employment was being terminated, effective immediately. I would receive a generous severance package, consistent with Danish law, and the company wished me well in finding a role that was a better fit for my skills and approach. I sat there in shock, unable to process what was happening. Fired after less than 2 weeks for doing what I had always been rewarded for. In American companies, the same approach that had built my career, that had earned me promotions and praise, had just ended my opportunity in Copenhagen. Almost before it began, security walked me to my desk, watched me collect my personal belongings, escorted me out of the building. All very polite, very professional, but utterly final. I stood on the street outside, in the January cold, holding a box with my things, trying to understand what had just happened. The hours after my termination were a blur. Went back to my temporary apartment, sat on the couch staring at the wall, replaying every interaction in my head, trying to figure out where it went wrong. Called a friend back in San Francisco, expecting sympathy and validation. She delivered exactly that. Said the company was clearly backwards, that they would regret losing someone with my expertise. That Danish culture was obviously problematic if they couldn't handle someone challenging them. But even as she said the words I wanted to hear, something was starting to shift in my mind. A small voice asking whether maybe, just maybe, I had been the problem. My first instinct was to go public, post about being fired from a Danish company for trying to make it more progressive. Let social media deliver its judgment. I drafted several versions of that post, each one framing me as the victim of a regressive culture not ready for change, the righteous activist silenced by the establishment. I knew it would go viral, knew my followers would rally to my defense. But before I posted, I decided to do something I should have done before I ever accepted the job. Actually research Danish workplace culture. Understand what I had walked into. What I learned over the following days changed my understanding of everything that had happened. Forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my own assumptions and behavior. Denmark wasn't a less progressive version of America, waiting to be enlightened by American ideas. It was a fundamentally different society that had developed its own approaches to the same problems I thought I was uniquely qualified to solve. Their solutions looked different because their context was different, and my assumption that American approaches were universally applicable had been arrogant and uninformed. I learned about Janny law, a cultural concept that discourages individual achievement at the expense of the collective, that values humility over self-promotion, consensus over confrontation. In that context, my confident assertions about what the company needed to change weren't seen as expertise being shared. They were seen as an individual placing herself above the group in ways that violated fundamental cultural norms. I wasn't being brave. I was being rude. I learned about the Danish approach to consensus building, where major decisions are made through extended dialogue that includes all stakeholders, rather than being pushed through by individuals with strong opinions and urgent timelines. My attempt to build support through individual conversations and my public push at the staff lunch weren't just ineffective. They were violations of how things are supposed to work. The right approach would have been to raise my observations with Henrik privately. Let any changes emerge through proper collective processes. Over time, not in days. I would have learned this if I had bothered to listen. Before acting, I learned about how Denmark has achieved gender equality through different means than America, focusing on making all choices viable, rather than pushing everyone toward the same choices. Their parental leave allows either parent to stay home. Their childcare system makes work accessible to everyone. Their compensation systems don't penalize people who prioritize work-life balance. The patterns I had identified as problems were actually evidence of a system working as intended, giving people genuine freedom to choose different paths without penalty. I learned about Danish directness, how they value honest, straightforward communication, but within a framework of mutual respect. My version of directness came across as attack, not engagement, because I hadn't earned the trust. That makes direct feedback acceptable. The most painful thing I learned was about myself, about how my training and experience had created blind spots that I had never been forced to confront until they destroyed an opportunity. I had spent years being rewarded for pushing against resistance, for treating discomfort as evidence of importance, for assuming that my perspective was more valid than the perspectives of people who disagreed. That approach had worked in a specific American context, but it wasn't universally applicable, and my assumption that it was had been a form of cultural arrogance that I hadn't even recognized. I decided not to post the victimhood narrative I had drafted, recognizing that doing so would just be another version of the same mistake, assuming I was right without considering that I might be wrong. Instead, I reached out to Henrik, asked if he would be willing to meet with me, not to argue for my job back, but to understand better what had happened and what I could learn from it. I expected him to ignore me or refuse, but he agreed, and that conversation became one of the most important learning experiences of my professional life. Henrik was gracious in a way I hadn't expected, just patient explanation. He said he had genuinely wanted me to succeed, that my termination wasn't personal, but was simply the recognition that the fit wasn't right. He walked me through specific moments where my approach had created problems, not to criticize but to help me understand how my actions had been perceived and why they had generated the response they did. The staff lunch was particularly damaging, he said. That space is sacred. It's where we build trust outside of work. By bringing work conflict into that space, you signaled that nothing was safe from your agenda. People felt ambushed, not engaged. He said my expertise wasn't worthless, but that applying it effectively required understanding context. I had tried to change a system I didn't yet understand, and in doing so I had made change less likely, not more, because now the organization would be wary of anyone with similar credentials. He said many Americans struggle in Danish workplaces because American culture emphasizes individual initiative, while Danish culture emphasizes collective harmony. Neither is wrong, they're just different. The key is recognizing which context you're in and adapting your approach accordingly, rather than assuming your native approach will work everywhere. I thanked him for his honesty, apologized for the disruption I had caused, asked if there was anything I could do to make it right. He said the best thing I could do was learn from the experience and approach my next opportunity differently. That would honor the lesson more than any apology could. I returned to America a few weeks later, humbled in ways I hadn't been since early in my career. When I was still learning how workplaces functioned, the experience in Denmark had forced me to question assumptions I had held so deeply that I hadn't even recognized them as assumptions. And that questioning changed how I approach my work. Going forward, I still believed in the importance of equity and inclusion, But I had learned that there were many ways to pursue those goals, and that my way wasn't automatically the right way. Found a new job at a company in Austin. Similar role, but with a different approach. One that prioritized understanding context before proposing changes, building relationships before pushing agendas, listening before leading. The work was slower than what I was used to. A less dramatic, fewer big moments of disruption, more sustained progress over time. I came to appreciate that this approach often accomplished more than the aggressive tactics I had used before, precisely because it didn't generate the resistance that made dramatic tactics feel necessary. Spent months at the new job just observing, asking questions, learning history, understanding why things were the way they were, before suggesting any changes. When I finally did make recommendations, they were better informed, more appropriate to the context, and more likely to be accepted. Because I had built the trust first. Looking back on Denmark now, I'm grateful for the experience. Even though it was painful and embarrassing at the time, those 48 hours that ended my job taught me more about cultural humility, the limits of ideology, and the importance of listening than years of success in American companies ever could. Sometimes the lessons you need most are the ones you can only learn through failure. And my failure in Copenhagen was exactly what I needed. The takeaway I want to share from this story is about the difference between principles and tactics, and why confusing the two can lead to failure. My principles around equity and fairness weren't wrong, but the tactics I had learned for pursuing them were specific to a particular context and didn't translate automatically to different environments. Being effective requires understanding context, and assuming that your approach will work everywhere is a form of arrogance that will eventually catch up with you. For anyone watching who works in diversity and inclusion, or any field that involves changing organizational culture, I hope this story encourages you to prioritize listening and understanding before acting. The people in the organizations you're trying to change have their own histories, values, and ways of doing things. Respecting that doesn't mean accepting things that are genuinely wrong. It means understanding what you're actually dealing with before deciding what needs to change. The most effective change agents I've known are the ones who build trust before pushing for change, who make people feel heard before asking them to hear something new. For anyone watching who has experienced cultural clashes in workplaces, whether international or just between different organizational cultures, I hope this story helps you feel less alone. Misunderstandings happen, mistakes happen. Sometimes we're so sure we're right that we can't see how we're coming across to others. The key is being willing to learn from those experiences, rather than just blaming the people who didn't respond the way you expected. Still think about Henrik sometimes, and Astrid and Lars and Freya. All the people at Nordvik I never got to know, because I was too busy trying to change them to actually see them. They deserved better than how I showed up. And I hope that in the years since, I've become someone who would approach that opportunity differently. We don't always get second chances at the opportunities we waste, but we can make sure we don't waste the next one the same way. Anyway, that's my story about trying to reform Danish workplace culture and getting terminated in 48 hours because I didn't understand what I was walking into. They weren't backwards or resistant to progress.